All right, KNES 310. I'm going to do a general review and also try to give you guys some guidance. Do a lot of reminders for those of you that are pretty consistent with your lectures. You're going to hear me say things over and over again. I don't, I don't mean to disrespect you. I'm just trying to get everybody up on the same page. Um, So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through this exam generally, and then if you want to, as always, if you want to look at your specific things, we can FaceTime and we can go over your test. Uh, I do want to lead off by saying I want to remind you that my grading scale is shifted. A 65 is a C, and I also want to remind you that the reason that I tell you guys that your test is open book and open notes is because I can't police that stuff anyway. And the students who are would listen to me if I asked you not to, but I can't police it. So I say, hey, use whatever you want. That's a blessing and a curse because what I'm afraid of is it makes some students less likely to really try to understand all the concepts going into the test, relying on their notes to answer every question. And this is conceptual stuff. So you should go into your third test with the mindset, I don't need my book. I got all the stuff here because I could figure out these answers based on what Dr. Campbell has taught me. Another thing I want to point out is every question, I even used several photos of me doing what I was asking you guys to see. So that's another thing I try to do to help you. So if you're still not seeing it, we got to figure out if you know. Another thing after going over the test yesterday with a few students is verbiage and getting into the habit of think of this as a new language and the best way to learn a language. I've told you this at the beginning of class too. The best way to learn a language is to talk it, to think it, to practice it. If you're awake, you can be studying this stuff, going over motions and positions. And okay, so this test is a student. Obviously, you're not going to see it, but this student made a 96. I bet you this student didn't have to refer to any of their notes. They know it. Okay, you can do it too, but it's going to take some work. It's going to take work. All right. So every single one of you have the capability of making this 96. We just got to put in the work. We just got to put in the work. Okay. What's the position of my trunk? This is where my sternum is facing the ground, but my pelvis is facing you, the camera. The only way, if my sternum and my pelvis are both facing the same direction, then I'm in anatomical. But if my sternum is facing the ground and my pelvis is facing you, then I have to be right transverse trunk rotated, whether that's rotating the pelvis this way or rotating the trunk that way. I'm twisted to my right. How many bones make up the left hip? Let's count them up. Ilium, ischium, pubis. There's your socket. Ball of the femur. 4. The ankle is a hinge joint. And if you got that part right, then the next part you should have gotten right as well. Because the hinge on a door allows the door to rotate 2 ways. So the hinge of your ankle allows your ankle to move 2 ways. I told you guys in the video I was going to ask you questions to see if you can not go with your instinct. Follow your intuition, not your instinct. That the ankle only allows. The analogy I gave yesterday during a review is the ankle is like the wheels on a skateboard. Now it's inverse, but the point is still there. The ankle is like the wheels propelling you. The subtalar joint is like how the skateboard can kind of wobble for balance. That's your subtalar joint. It's a different joint. It's a different area. So if you got hinge right, then you should have gotten 2 ways of motion correct as well, okay? The knee joint is specifically a modified hinge. It's modified, remember? It doesn't work like a typical hinge because when you unlock it, it can rotate in its transverse plane. Modified hinge. Okay, the next one, I used a photo from class. It was the one of me pivoting about my right hip. And I even used my hand as a marker to try to show you that my left hip is staying in anatomical. That was my way of trying to be like, 2 classic illusions here. My right hip looks like it's not moving, but it is. My left hip looks like it's moving, and it's not. Straight from the lecture. Illusions are powerful, guys. Okay, so my left leg would be in what position? I put things like externally rotated, internally rotated, abducted, adducted. It was none of these because my left leg is in anatomical position. Okay. Okay, this is another one, same picture that I'm, my sternum's facing the ground, my pelvis is facing you. My sternum stays looking at the floor, and my pelvis undergoes right transverse. So if my pelvis is, I'm going to use my phone. If you're looking up at me from the floor, my sternum's looking at the floor, my pelvis is rotated this way looking at the screen. If my pelvis undergoes right transverse, then I went from being twisted to my right to anatomical position. My pelvis goes from here to there. My trunk goes from here to there. So I have to have left transverse trunk rotation to bring me home. Okay? Left transverse trunk rotation, and then what's happening at the right hip horizontal adduction. Okay. I told you guys that I was going to do the kneel questions. I told you those were difficult. I did a micro lecture to try to re-emphasize certain things, to try to show you different ways to look at it. So this one, he's kneeling, his left knee is on the ground, and his right hip is flexed, his right knee is flexed, his right foot is on the ground. From the starting position, he undergoes left lateral pelvic girdle rotation. Lots of you got the left hip abduction right. Hey, that's good, man. Claiming little victories. The hard one is the pelvis. So how I want you to think about it is, if my hand represents my foot, so here's my foot, here's my knee, here's my hip, okay? You got to use your imagination. If my hip is like this, here's my pelvis, okay? If my pelvis, let's see if I can get this. If my pelvis does this, my hip is externally rotated. Externally rotated. Another way to look at it, if my pelvis does this, and I lifted everything up off the ground, froze it, and said, how would I have to rotate my hip to go back home? I'd have to internally rotate it to go back home. Therefore, I externally rotated it when I left home. Internal, external, internal, external, internal, external. Okay? It's not easy. But upper level kinesiology courses, there is no rule that says learning this material is easy. And in fact, this is really important. I'm hoping you guys are starting to see the benefit of truly understanding what's happening here, because you're going to have to apply this stuff. You're going to have to not fall for these illusions where you think you need to work certain muscles, but it's not. Or you think that there's normal range of motion in a joint when there's not. There's therapy that may need to happen in a certain joint, but unless you know how to look for these illusions, you would never think it. Okay? It's important to understand this stuff. I explained in one of my lectures for my physical education majors how I could have improved my performance growing up if my coaches would have understand to look for illusions, where I was very tight in my hips and there was illusions there that prevented them from seeing it, or my coach that was trying to get me to keep my elbow in when I shot, and he thought I just wasn't listening to him, when the reality was I had no external rotation in my shoulder in order to get my elbow in. So for my physical educators and my future coaches, this is important too, so that you're trying to coach an athlete, a boy or a girl, and trying to help them with their form, and they're just not able to do it. Maybe it's not their fault. Maybe we need to get the athletic trainer in here and look at their range of motion and see if there's some, maybe you can help them to eventually follow through on your coaching. Maybe there's some limitations within their body that you or they don't know about. Okay? All important stuff. Next one, as discussed in class, motion at the knee joint is because of the articulation of the tibia and the femur. That is straight from my lectures. Straight from my lectures. You can flex and extend. You can, if you were Harry Potter, or if you were, Harry Potter, you could snap your fingers with a spell and that patella disappeared. Guess what? You could still flex and extend your knee because it's about this moving about this. The patella lives there, and the patella has its own articulation with the femur, but it's just a floating, it's a floating sesamoid bone. It's a subclass of a flat. It's there to protect and it's there to redirect pull, but the knee, the articulation is femur and tibia. Tibia and femur. That's straight from your lecture. The old cut and plant. I told you guys this was coming. The question is, the girl is cutting and planting. So this, let's pretend this is her left leg. And we know if this is the left, external, internal, external, internal, external, internal, cap and bottle. So if this is external by moving the small piece, right? This is going to be external by moving the big piece. And I could see it because if I bring everything back, see, I'd have external rotation there. Small piece about the big piece about the small piece. And I told you guys why this is tricky. Because you want to bring everything to global reference. If this moves this way and that's external, then anything that moves that way is external. And that's not how joint motions work. Okay? So, her left knee would be flexed and externally rotated. And again, there's clues in there. You could look at her patella, because when you flex, that patella gets locked into that condyle, and that patella ain't going anywhere. If your patella does go somewhere when your knee is flexed, it's dislocated. It's a bad day. So you could even look at her patella, if her patella's here, and you could say, oh man, that foot is lateral to her patella. Yeah, because her knee is externally rotated. That's why. Or put it another way, why is her foot lateral to her patella? Because of the external rotation. Okay, this is when she goes up on her left hip. She hikes up the right side, so she has left lateral pelvic girdle rotation, and she recurves back to her right to keep her shoulders level. I had two different questions here. Which hip had no effect on her pelvic girdle rotation? The hip that's up in the air. The hip that's up in the air. I taught you guys that. So her right hip is up in the air. Her right hip cannot make the pelvis. Think of it like this. Her right leg's up in the air. That pelvis ain't coming back down until her left hip adducts. Because her right hip could woo, wee, woo. Until her left hip adducts, that pelvis isn't going to stop pouring water out the left side. Okay? So which hip had no effect on pelvic girdle rotation? The one that's up in the air. And what motion is occurring at the trunk? Well, if her pelvis, let's see, left lateral, if her pelvis is pouring water out the left side, her trunk has to recurve back to her right. So another way to look at this is her trunk recurves back to the right. If you brought the pelvis back to anatomical, she's leaning to her right. Okay? Illusions. Illusions. Here's a picture of me, straight from class. Identify the positions of the hips. I have right lateral pelvic girdle rotation. My right hip is abducted, my left hip is adducted. We did this question several times in the lectures, okay? Several times. So you should be noticing a pattern that I ask questions that we review several times, because that's my way of saying they should be prepared for this information. Okay. How many planes can the pelvic girdle rotate in, and how many total rotations does it have? Pelvic girdle can rotate in sagittal, frontal, transverse, 3 planes, 2 directions of spin in each, anterior, posterior, plus right, left lateral, plus right, left transverse, 2, 4, 6. So 3 and 6 was the answer to that one. Identify the joint positions of the right ankle and right hip. This is doing the lunge question. Okay, the lunge question, and the knee was over the toes. This isn't this class isn't about what you should or shouldn't do, good form or bad form. I actually purposefully Googled bad form because I'm just trying to show you how to look at motion and positions. Okay, so don't misinterpret this, man, that's horrible form. Yeah, I'm not saying it's not, but this isn't a horrible form class. This is a human movement class. So the ankle is dorsiflexed and the right hip is flexed. So dorsiflexed and flexed. Okay, another kneeling on the left knee. Left knee is touching the ground. Right foot is on the ground. This was the left transverse. So if I'm here, I'm kneeling, this foot on the ground, this knee on the ground, and I have left transverse, left hip internal, right hip horizontal. So remember, this is my leg, horizontal, horizontal add, horizontal ab, horizontal add, horizontal ab, horizontal add, horizontal ab, horizontal add, horizontal ab, horizontal add. So if the pelvis starts here and does this, here's the hip, horizontal ab, horizontal ab. Okay, this is the Roman chair where the girl brings her body up. She's going to have posterior pelvic girdle rotation because of her bilateral hip extension. If she'd be lowering herself down, anterior pelvic girdle rotation because of bilateral hip flexion. Okay. This is question number 16 was straight from your first test. Straight from your first test. They're in the leg extension machine. I hate that because you flex just as many times as you extend. So she's in that little machine, and from this position, she moves her knees away from anatomical. Well, her knees in anatomical would be locked out, right? So if she was going to anatomical, she'd have extension. So if she's going from anatomical, she's at flexion. On the first test, I taught you guys specifically how to infer motion. We could do before or after pictures, or we can have one picture and we analyze where the joint is relative to anatomical, and then we say, are you going home or are you going away from home? Are you going to anatomical or away from anatomical? If I'm in Verbiage, I need more information before I know if you're traveling east or west. Lafayette is home. Are you going towards home? You're going west. Are you going away from home? You're going east. First test stuff. You take your foot off the gas and then press on the brake. Which ankle motions? So if you're like doing all kinds of hip stuff, that's cool. But I specifically said what would happen if you just use your ankle. So if you have your foot on the gas and you plantar flex, you just sped up. Dorsiflexion is going to take your foot off the gas, and then plantar flexion is going to press on the brake. So dorsiflexion followed by plantar flexion. When several vertebrae contribute to significant motion. Okay, let's take a field trip. Straight from lecture, guys. Straight from lecture. Any two vertebra is insignificant, slightly movable. Amphiarthrotic, synchondrotic because of cartilage, syndesmotic because of ligament. But that's only two. That's like saying if I take out my pocket change, is that significant money? No, it's something, but it's not going to buy you lunch. You need several days of change before it is of significance. So the concept of gliding or orthotibial joints is not just two vertebrae, but several that contribute to significant motion. Okay, so the answer was orthotibial. That's in your book. And not only that, I tried to funnel it down for you. When several vertebrae contribute to significant motion, we consider this type of diarthrotial joint. I tried to walk you down the path. Okay. All right. This one, she's doing the side lunge, and I ask you to identify what's the obvious motion and what does the ankle do? Plantar flexion, dorsiflexion. All of the answer choices had inversion, eversion. That's subtalar and transverse dorsal joints. So none of those answers were correct because your ankle does not invert or evert. So the answer was none of these. I told you I was going to ask you. I didn't tell you how I was going to do it. In class, I may say 2 + 2 is 4. But for me to check your understanding, I need to ask on the test, what's 2 + 3? That's how I'm going to test your understanding of math, if you can do math. It's not just to regurgitate questions that I give you, it's to check for your understanding. I told you I was going to ask a question about ankle stuff, doing inversion and eversion. This is the way I did it. Let this be a lesson that ankle motion is entrenched in our minds from a small age to include anything your foot does. That's not true. Ankle is the wheel. Subtalar is the glide. Okay. This is the girl on the horizontal, the inner thigh machine where she's seated, and her legs do this or that, or this or that, or this or that. What specific hip motion? Specific hip motion would occur if she brought her knees closer together. Horizontal adduction. Horizontal adduction. From anatomical position, I go to the above photo. Again, I used another photo from my lecture. Pelvis is rotated right laterally, and the trunk is also bent right lateral. Clues in the clothing. If I lean to my left, my clothes is going to scrunch down on the left side. It's going to stretch out on the right side. So you can see the clothes scrunched on the right side and stretched on the left side because my trunk bent. Remember, you can cancel out, but you don't have to. If my pelvis does this and my trunk bends that, usually that's when I need to bend down to grab something, hold something, catch something. It cancels when I need to keep my shoulders level. In that photo, my shoulders are not level. I'm looking at the photo right now. My shoulders are like this. If my pelvis does this and I want my shoulders to stay level, I'm going to recurve back the other way. But if I want to go in the same direction, I go this way, and now my shoulders are way over here. Again, usually to grab something, pick something up, catch something. So right lateral pelvic, right lateral trunk. Going down on a squat would cause what motions at the knees and the hips? Knee flexion, hip flexion. Coming up, knee extension, hip extension. Okay, this is the lady that starts here and then she goes up on her left hip. Same question, right leg's up in the air and her trunk is recurved to keep her shoulders level. From left to right, what would be the motion of her hip that made the pelvis rotate, and what's the rotation of the pelvis? So left hip abduction and left lateral pelvic girdle rotation. Okay, I go to this position in the photo from anatomical. This is me standing with the skeleton to try to I'm trying to show you what the pelvis is doing. I use that picture specifically to try to help you. I go to this position from anatomical, right lateral pelvic girdle rotation because of right hip abduction, abduction. Okay, last question. You are standing in anatomical position with both feet obviously in contact with the ground. From this starting position, you undergo left transverse pelvic girdle rotation. What hip motions must have occurred? If you stand up, keep both feet on the ground. Both feet, nice. Keep both feet on the ground. And you do left transverse. And remember, the pelvis is always right. The pelvis is never lost. And you look at that pelvis, and then you ask yourself, man, my hip is not lined up with my pelvis anymore. Hey, left hip, you look to be internally rotated. And the left hip is like, yeah, I look to be internally rotated because I am. And then you do the same thing. You say, hey, right hip, your foot, my foot is lateral to my pelvis. How did you get that way in the right hip side? Because I externally rotated. So left hip internal, right hip external. If you watch the lectures, you can't say I didn't show you that over and over and over again. Another thing too, guys, is maybe one student, hey, Dr. Campbell, do you have a few minutes to clarify that pelvic girdle rotation stuff? Absolutely. Shoot me a holler, man. Let's FaceTime. Call me. I'll clarify things for you, okay? So in summary, every single question was stuff I went over several times and pulled straight from my lectures. I personally think that you should go into any of my tests not dependent on notes. Like I said, I let you do it because there's no way of me policing it. But all of these concepts should be here. You should be able to see these things happening and know these things because you practice it so much, you speak it so much. When you're exercising, you should be reviewing. When you're watching things on TV, you should be reviewing. When you're studying, you should be reviewing. Get into study groups if need be. Talk the language. Okay? I hope this helped. Once again, contact me. I think I'm gonna give y'all a break. No new material Friday. Use Friday to catch up. Use Friday maybe to go through first test stuff and re-engage your mind to sagittal, frontal, transverse concepts, position concepts. How do we infer motion from before and after pictures? Because guys, the upper extremity is a whole new set of illusions. Different challenges with the upper extremity, but illusions there are. So use Friday to review, to practice, and next Monday is game on. Okay? I hope everybody's well, and I hope this helped more than anything. Bye.